Some weeks ago, I revisited a classic from my childhood. Contra III, The Alien Wars. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Contra is a run-and-gun game. You run, shoot everything that moves, and avoid everything that isn't you. Simple, right? Well, there's a catch. Get hit once, you lose a life, lose all your lives, and you're booted back to the start of the game. There is no mercy, no hand-holding, and you have to do it all over again. And I wouldn't have it any other way. I know this concept sounds punishing beyond belief, especially if you're not used to it. But there is something absurdly satisfying about getting knocked out repeatedly and building up the muscle memory until you're finally able to see the pattern in the chaos, and then just dance within it. That moment when you take down the boss that gave you hell without losing a single life is such a rewarding experience. And when you pull it off in hard mode, unlocking the real ending of the game, that's a whole new level of triumph. And after I finished the game, I started to wonder. Because I felt this way before. It wasn't when I played this game as a kid, no. It was recently. Oh yeah, that's the good stuff. Even though Contra and Elden Ring are 30 years apart and do not share the same genre, graphics, style, music, or length, one thing still unites them. They share a core philosophy, and that is, no victory comes without effort. Everyone will agree there are countless games which would be long forgotten if it wasn't for that little extra pinch of challenge. Because at its best, difficulty transforms a game into something unforgettable. But with only some exceptions like Elden Ring, it seems like games have gotten easier over time. Not that this is a bad thing. Numerous games exist which don't have an iota of challenge in their veins and are incredibly successful. Still, there is a visible trend going on right now. I remember certain 8, 16 and even 64-bit pieces that were so rage-inducing you had to buy a gamepad monthly. No, it's undeniable, modern games favor accessibility over difficulty. And this trend raises some interesting questions. The first one is, of course, why have games become easier over time? Followed by which games actually profit from difficulty and where is it unnecessary? And what happens now? Will games stay that way? Or will we enter another evolutionary step anytime soon? To answer these questions, we must set off on a journey to explore the highs and lows of gaming difficulty. We will see how it has shaped our medium, our experiences, and even ourselves. Welcome to the history of difficulty, a story of grit, growth, and the joy of earning every hard-fought victory. You might think difficult games are a niche phenomenon, but you'd be mistaken. Challenging games have existed far longer than most people realize, and their influence on the gaming industry is profound. In fact, I'd go so far as to call these games the allfather of everything that followed. To explain why, we need to travel back to the 1970s and 80s. During that time, nearly all video games were difficult to beat. And this was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate design choice. But why? Well, the short answer is,
hello, I like money.
And the slightly longer answer is,
money.
I'm limited by the technology of my time.
The biggest challenges developers faced in the 1980s were technological limitations and the cost of electronic components. These constraints influenced every aspect of game development. For instance, computer science was still in its infancy compared to today, and hardware components were massively expensive. Memory space in particular was a premium luxury. To put things into perspective, the IBM 3380, the first hard drive capable of storing more than 1 GB of data, launched in 1980. It could hold 2.5 gigabytes, but weighed 550 pounds, was the size of a refrigerator and cost at least $81,000, roughly $310,000 when adjusted for inflation today. And even then it wouldn't have enough space to download games like Baldur's Gate. Given these costs and the physical impracticality of hard drives, developers turned to a more affordable and compact alternative: read-only memory chips. These chips stored game data permanently, and while they were cheaper than hard drives, they still represented a significant expense. Each ROM chip had to be custom built with the game's data baked in during manufacturing. Developers worked from blueprints, designing both the software and the hardware. These chips would then be plugged into a printed circuit board and a result could look like this. The thing you're seeing right now is a functioning game of Donkey Kong. It is important to understand that games back then were not completely software-based and were rather a meticulous fusion of software and hardware. Producing a single game this way could still cost hundreds of dollars back then, which adjusted for inflation translates to thousands today. So manufacturing even a limited run of a single game represented a significant financial risk for developers. And this brings us to a very critical question. With such high production costs, how could developers turn a profit or at least break even? No individual customer could reasonably afford the cost of arcade PCBs or machines themselves. So again, the developers had to get creative and they found their answer in the arcades, bars, and malls. By building special machines with a screen that housed one of those games each, and by placing these machines in public venues and charging players per session, companies could spread the cost across thousands of players. Each player contributed small amounts, usually 25 cents at the time, but this added up to significant revenue streams. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the birth of the pay-per-play model. Now hold on a minute, what does all of this have to do with difficulty in gaming? Yeah, I was just getting to that. Arcade games needed to generate a lot of money because they cost a lot to build. So how do you maximize the amount of people who will try out your pay-per-play machine? And this is where the actual game design works its magic, and it has to do two things exceptionally well. One, they have to draw players in when they walk by the machine. Games had to look, sound, and feel exciting enough to tempt people to spend their first quarter. This is why so many arcade games feature bright colors, flashing lights, catchy soundtracks. When walking past the machine, it must sound, nay, feel like a siren calling out to you. And as a personal reference, they did. And two, people need to come back and play some more, but not too long, and that is the tricky part. The longer a player stays on a single coin, the less money the machine makes. So a fine line must be walked between brutally whipping your ass and being enticing enough to make you reach yet another time for your wallet. These games were built to beat you, but only after giving you a small taste of victory. The only way to make that happen was to present a perfectly polished gameplay loop that is tough, but also kind of fair, at least most of the time. You need to be able to learn from your mistakes and actually get a chance to get better, preferably after you throw the next coin in. Combine that with some good rewards and it got you hooked. Be it more gameplay, a power-up, or the congratulations message at the end along with a #1 spot on the high scoreboard. Let's stay with Donkey Kong as an example. In the beginning, it's deceptively easy. Just climb the platforms, jump over some barrels which roll down the beams in a straight line, and reach the top where Pauline is waiting for you. Easy, right? Well, you, my friend, are in for a rude awakening. A few levels in and the barrels not just roll down, they fall down in increasingly unpredictable ways. More often than not, they seem to develop a mind of their own, since now they can take ladders the same way you do, and then you don't look for a second and before you know it, you're scrambling for another quarter to try again. That was not the only way to make the game incrementally harder either. Sometimes it was sufficient enough to just accelerate the game after every level. This dynamic of easy to start, hard to master, wasn't just a revenue strategy. It became an art form, and the best gameplay loops toyed with your emotions. Each victory, no matter how small, felt good. And each loss? Throw another coin in the machine to make the sting of shame go away. Arcade difficulty wasn't a bug, it was a feature. It kept players hooked, filling arcades with the sound of clinking quarters and the hum of machines running from open to close. So we found the reason why video games were difficult in the past. It was about survival and profit. But what happens to that inherent difficulty if that pay-per-play model becomes obsolete? What if, and that is purely hypothetical, some upstart company manages to build way smaller arcade machines? What if these machines were also able to play many games and not just one, by being able to switch out those clunky PCBs on the fly? And what if that little machine only cost a fraction to manufacture, so that every middle-class household could afford it? What happens then to difficulty? More importantly, what happens to video games as a whole? Of course, that scenario wouldn't stay hypothetical for long. In fact, home consoles already existed during the 70s, with prominent examples being the Magnavox Odyssey and the Atari 2600. But here's the thing. These consoles were a far cry from what an actual arcade machine could produce. The sound was crisper, there was more color, the gameplay felt simply better. It is like switching between low resolution and full HD. Sure, low resolution gets the job done, but you know you prefer better quality. So I've got a question. Why would you, as a customer, invest into a big ticket item like the Nintendo Entertainment System and then fork over another additional $50 for every game purchased? Especially when it is an inferior version to the arcade game you can play whenever you feel like it for a fraction of that money. Remember, adjusted for inflation, a single game could cost about $150 today. That's a lot of Pac-Man sessions and then some. To overcome this challenge, developers needed to ensure that their console wasn't just a cheaper arcade alternative, but a distinct experience worth owning. So it goes without saying that a bit of innovation in game design was necessary again. And after some experimentation, a new type of game emerged, and it took the world by storm. Instead of short gameplay loops that got harder and harder, these games were longer and more complex. Games like The Legend of Zelda and Metroid introduced sprawling worlds, exploration, and a sense of adventure. Other entries, like Ninja Gaiden, suddenly presented a story they wanted to tell, and hid it behind unforgiving reflex-based challenges. Yet other entries, like Super Mario Bros., tested your skills time and time again by constantly introducing new level layouts. Where only a skill check existed earlier, players now embarked on journeys, solved puzzles, honed their skills, and unlocked secrets. The inclusion of battery-backed save systems in cartridges allowed players to pick up where they left off. And if that wasn't the case, then the game usually featured some kind of password system to let you resume playing from a certain level, or it had some checkpoints somewhere in between, so you were not doomed to go back to the beginning when you lost all your lives. So, in most cases, you could turn the console off anytime and your progress wouldn't get lost. And I think that's the keyword here. These games were progress-based. And the best thing was that these games were always hiding a little something more. A bit more story, a new level, a cool secret nobody found yet except you, or simply a new challenge to conquer. And it was always just one more screen away. But here's the catch. All of this would be completely meaningless if it was just given to you. For all its innovation, this new model still presented a risk. If games were too short or too easy, players might feel they weren't getting their money's worth. And if you played it, then I invite you to imagine the open world of Legend of Zelda, either without enemies, or just replace every enemy with the easiest one. Throw everything else out. Also, while we're at it, give the player the solution to every puzzle. Not in a cryptic form, but in plain speak. Preferably in the same room the puzzle is in. So basically, you just need to go through the dungeons and mindlessly follow directions until you eventually finish the game. Quick question, does that sound familiar to you?
Think you can reach the wheel from here? They cap those geysers? I think we need to get that wheel moving, but the water doesn't reach.
Because I can tell you right now, you, as an 80s kid, would definitely be pissed that you spent your year's allowance on this. You'd be done with the game in about 2 hours max. And just that for $150? Yeah, I don't think so. I want a refund. And funny enough, that is almost the topic that is discussed among players today. That games are not gripping enough because the world feels barren or the gameplay is just shallow. Especially when it comes to AAA titles, the only difference is that today's games are way longer. This was a necessary side jab from my side, thank you, now back to the 80s and 90s. To prevent exactly that from happening, developers used difficulty. And they used it in a way that made games memorable. Owning a game meant you had infinite attempts to conquer its challenges, and developers knew this. They could and should design tougher bosses, more intricate puzzles and head-scratching mazes because now players have time to master them. In the arcades, difficulty and failure were used to signal the player to throw more coins in or move along. It was a profit-based necessity, but these games make them an integral part of the journey. Failure is now tied to the progression of the game, and difficulty became a deliberate tool to stretch out gameplay and keep players invested. This may sound a bit dramatic, but difficulty was the key element to create meaningful challenges. The satisfaction of finally timing a perfect jump in Mega Man or figuring out a strategy to take a boss down in Castlevania created an emotional connection with the game that justified the price tag. But I admit, I would be remiss to not mention that some developers overshot the target quite drastically. Let's face it, some games were just shovelware, made to make a quick buck and were absolutely not worth your time. Yet other games really cranked up the difficulty and were borderline unfair, just to stretch the gameplay out as long as possible. For this video, I played Battletoads and Ninja Gaiden, and all I can say is that level 6 of Ninja Gaiden and the final boss can go eat a dick. And don't get me started on those goddamn balls. And while it is true that some developers went quite overboard with the difficulty or simply forgone the crucial testing phase, the fact that you had to work for your reward still stands. Mega Man 2's Heatman stage, it had me howling because I hate these timed blocks that require perfect jumps. But when you actually did it, it felt glorious. And from this moment on, I can repeat the sequence anytime I want. Nobody except Alzheimer's can take that away from me. And clearing Zelda's dungeons filled me with a genuine sense of accomplishment because I figured out how to clear these dungeons without any help. Of course, it took time, but that was also fun. Did I find everything? Probably not. Do I care? Hell no, because this is my adventure. I get to say how and when it ends. Don't get me wrong, if you know what you're doing, you can beat these games in a couple of hours easy. It's like a book you read. Once you reach the end, you know everything about it and don't necessarily need to reread or replay it. But getting to that level of mastery was more often than not the whole point. This emphasis on difficulty wasn't just about gameplay. Weirdly enough, it created a sense of community. Players shared experiences of overcoming impossible odds like veterans of war. They swapped tips and strategies in person or in gaming magazines like Nintendo Power. And this bonding over shared struggles turned these games into more than just products. They became milestones in gaming history. So much so that these difficult-to-beat games received their own label. They were called Nintendo Hard. During the next few years, the young medium of video games underwent a massive transformation. It evolved from niche toy to mainstream entertainment capable of competing with movies and TV. In fact, gaming was everywhere. TV commercials hyped up the latest cartridges, Sonic the Hedgehog starred in Saturday morning cartoons, and Lara Croft became a pop culture phenomenon. She wasn't just on game boxes, she graced magazine covers, appeared in music videos, and even became the subject of debate over the portrayal of women in media. Oh, and there was also this little movie called Mortal Kombat, which was based on a video game.
Flawless victory.
But along with the mainstream recognition came controversy. Video games, now more realistic and intense than ever, became the subject of heated debates. In Senate hearings and on news channels, critics labeled games as being made by the devil and blamed them for corrupting the youth.
Training on this cop-killing simulator.
Yeah, because that's all video games are. Killer simulators. This horse you see right now? Ice-cold murderer of a family of 4. His name's Twinkle, but don't you get too close, he'll bite your head clean off. But on a serious note, what exactly happened? Video games were the domain of arcade junkies, hobbyists. It was the favorite pastime of the social outcast. It was ranked just above throwing your life away by using drugs, and now they're this cultural juggernaut? I mean, I'm not complaining, but how? Well, the answer lies in a combination of savvy marketing, technological advancements, and a gradual shift in game design philosophy, which in turn had massive ramifications on how difficulty was used yet again. One of the earliest drivers of gaming's rise to prominence can be found in how consoles were marketed.
Will your family be the first to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System? Will you be the first to see, to touch, to play with Rob, the extraordinary video robot? He follows the commands you put on screen to help you tackle even the toughest challenge. Will you be the first to raise the incredibly accurate Zapper and play games like Duck Hunt and Hogan's Alley? The first to build a library of game packs like Kung Fu and Golf? even games like Excitebike that you program yourself. Will you be the first to get all this in one package? The Nintendo Entertainment System, where video technology is more than a game.
From the very beginning, companies like Nintendo pushed the idea that gaming wasn't just for lone enthusiasts anymore. They opted for a rebranding instead and made it a social activity. Take the NES for example. Nintendo didn't just sell you games, they sold you the idea of sitting down with your kids, siblings, or friends to conquer levels in Super Mario, Zelda, and Contra. Even brutally hard games like Ninja Gaiden could turn into bonding experiences as you yelled at each other to dodge enemies and share triumphs over those pixel-perfect jumps. It wasn't just about beating a game, it was about sharing the experience. And as the industry matured, companies realized there was even more potential to expand gaming's audience. Why stop at teenagers and families? Why not market to everyone?
And not just the men, but the women. And the children, too.
But with a growing audience of younger gamers, casual gamers, and even non-gamers, this standard approach was becoming kind of a barrier. Games like Ghosts and Goblins and Mega Man offered brutal difficulty to pad out relatively short games. And it's also used to create head-scratching puzzles and tactical problems, like finding your way through a labyrinth or fighting battles where your units can be permanently killed. And therein lies the problem. What if it's too difficult? Do you think little Stacy next door can identify with Rambo? Or survive the opening screen of any NES shooter? Chances are she might not be interested in that or simply get frustrated. But guess what? She might fall in love with a world filled with color, like in Kirby's Adventure, where the focus is on fun and creativity rather than twitch reflexes. And this shift towards accessibility wasn't just about making games easier, it was about rethinking what games could be. Games had to be battles of endurance or skill no longer. They could be about solving light puzzles while diving into the story of an RPG, or building cities in the latest simulation game like SimCity, or even living out a quiet life on a farm in Harvest Moon. In short, difficulty became just another but equally important tool in a game designer's toolbox among other new tools like exploration, simulation, storytelling, and many others. As a prime example, I invite you to look at Pokémon Red and Blue, which were introduced to the world in 1996. These Game Boy games shaped the bedroom and future of countless children. And the focus of these games lies in exploring the world to capture wild monsters, which are called Pokémon. And then you use these Pokémon to fight other Pokémon, which can either be wild or domesticated by other people. And if you had a friend who also played either version, Red or Blue, you were even able to battle your friend and trade your Pokémon for different ones. Difficulty is definitely not the driving force of this game. That was swapped out for social aspects and exploration, which, as we all know, turned out to be an extremely good move for Nintendo. Reason number 2 for the widespread victory march of video games is yet again the ongoing technological advancements in the field. With faster processors and more affordable components, developers were able to diversify the portfolio of gaming even more. For example, pixel graphics became more detailed and way less abstract. This was notably evident when the games made the jump from 8-bit to 16-bit consoles like the Mega Drive or the Super NES. And yet another milestone was achieved when developers were able to render actual 3D objects and environments. Now combine this with improved storage capabilities like compact discs, and suddenly you have space for cutscenes and actual voice acting.
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
This realistic look felt like a break from the label kiddie toy and appealed to a wider and more mature audience on both the consumer and creator side. And that is an absolutely important distinction to make. Because from this point on, writers, artists, and filmmakers saw this shining new medium as a golden opportunity to bring their works to life or enhance a video game with their expertise. And I'm not gonna lie, sometimes the results were not that great, but at other times the creations were masterpieces we still talk about today. The game time can now be prolonged by any means imaginable, but preferably by cinematically conveying a story or creating an environment where the player can just get lost in. This era was also blessed with the rise of PC gaming, which profited immensely from these new technologies. The home computer churned out one classic after the other, from Doom to Baldur's Gate to Warcraft to Morrowind to Counter-Strike. Even little Stacy found her favorite game of all time in The Sims, a life simulator which she uses to create avatars of people she doesn't like, and then she proceeds to drown them in a pool. And why is she doing this? Because every game is a killer simulator, haven't you heard the news yet? But what about difficulty in general? Is the model of brutally punishing games obsolete now as well? Oh no. Not yet at least. See, developers knew that some games were nothing without a good challenge. But in order to draw new players in, they still had to lower the barrier of entry in some way. So they simply made it a habit to equip every single game with a difficulty slider, which were already a thing way back when. And so games like Contra for the Super NES give you the option to choose between easy, normal or hard mode. Start on easy mode, then work your way up to hard, if you like. Either way, the game's designed for you to have a grand old time. Like I said, difficulty became just another tool in a game maker's toolkit, and after decades of experience, they knew when and how to use this tool. But if this tool is simply forgotten, misused, or about to be straight up sacrificed at the altar of accessibility, then this might just create some problems for the future. While the 80s had the problem of producing games that were too hard to beat and only appealed to a fraction of the demographic, the time we live in now seems to overcorrect into the opposite extreme. Video games, especially when they're made by big studios, try to cater to everyone by being as accessible as they can possibly be. Now don't get me wrong, this goal deserves praise, but when used poorly it can backfire tremendously. By simplifying mechanics, reducing difficulty, and prioritizing inclusivity at the expense of depth, games don't just risk losing their core identity, they also start alienating longtime fans. And this is of course a steady process, it didn't happen overnight. And you can actually see the process when you compare one game of a franchise with another game from the same franchise. I know what you're thinking. You're expecting Dragon Age Veilguard, right? I am so sorry to disappoint you. I present the Thief trilogy for the PC, which released during the years of 1998 to 2004, and we will compare it with the remake/reimagining Thief 2014, which came out in 2014. In all these games you play as Garrett, a thief in a nondescript medieval city, and there's also some steampunk and magic in it. Your targets are rich people in manors and castles, and you steal everything you can, not just to get rich, but because you love the challenge. The game is divided into missions, where you have to fulfill certain objectives and of course get as much loot out of the level as you can. The Thief trilogy was revolutionary in many ways and defined the golden standard for the stealth genre at the time. As a thief, you need shadows and dark places to stay hidden from the guards and supernatural beings that want to arrest or kill you. And how well you're actually hidden can be seen by a little crystal at the bottom of the screen. If it's pitch black, you're basically a ghost and you're safe. But once you step into the light, the gem starts to shine, and if a guard is near while you do this, run! Why? Because you're a thief and not a fighter. Combat is not your friend, it's a last resort. I mean, nothing's stopping you to try, but the combat system was made intentionally clunky to discourage players from dispatching everything in sight. And also, you will die in just a few hits. No, the best way to get around is to look at the routes the guards take and then either slip past, distract them, or whack them with your jack-black. Sorry, I mean blackjack from behind to knock them unconscious. And even that had a drawback, because now you have a body which you need to hide somewhere where nobody can find it. You could also take the guards out with a bow and a headshot, but that would alarm every guard in a 1 mile radius because the bastard screams before he goes down. But if you played these games on the hardest difficulty setting, then killing, even accidental killing, was out of the question anyway, since it led to an immediate fail of the mission. See, you're not a thief anymore. You're a professional. You have standards and you are not going to drop them. Also, the higher the difficulty, the more loot you have to find before the mission is labeled a success.
I wonder if he reads them or if it's just for show.
Which means, yes, you have to look into every little nook and cranny. While you do all this, it is best to stay in the shadows and also silent. Your steps make sound and guards can pinpoint your location, especially if you walk on loud floors like metal.
Hey! You over there! Don't move!
This mechanic added another layer of strategic gameplay because sometimes the fastest but also most dangerous way was through a patch of loud reverberating tiles. Now tell me, do you find another way or do you risk it? You don't have to, by the way. The levels are complex and open-ended. If you want to enter a Lord's Manor via the basement, you can do that. You just have to look out for the servants who will sound the alarm once they see you. You can also get in through the tower, but that affords a bit of timing and a special rope arrow which costs some money. Secrets and hidden passages exist, of course, but the game will not tell you that outright. You have to find them yourself by simply keeping an eye open, getting lucky, or finding a document or a hint that gives the secret away. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Thief in a nutshell. Thief is a hard game, but a fun one because the game respects your intelligence. It gives you all the time you need and presents levels that encourage you to find your own way through. The first noticeable change in the formula came with the third installment. Play it and you can tell that the core mechanics are still here and intact. But it is also evident that the game was made easier and more accessible for newcomers. For example, the no-kill rule was changed to do not kill non-combatants, which means now hunting guards like deer in the forest is accepted. But it's still not easy. After all, combat is still clunky as hell. Your sword, which you had in the previous games, is now a puny dagger, and your health still is pretty much non-existent on higher difficulty levels. But you're able to finish the guards off with a well-placed arrow from the shadows without risking a game over now. Also, the loot as much as you can rule still applied. On the hardest difficulty, the game even requires you to rob an old lady of her retirement money if you wanted to continue the game. The levels, although a bit more linear, were still open and didn't give away the treasures easily. There was still a bit of detective work necessary, which made you feel like the king of the world once you figured it out. But by the time the remake rolled around, everything changed. And these changes have been widely criticized as both a disservice to the series and an example of poor game design. The open levels were switched to exclusively linear and very hand-holdy sections. Sections you can't even revisit once you walk past a certain checkpoint, which means the loot you didn't collect was unreachable as well.
This is my way out, but once I drop down, there's no coming back.
But guess what? It doesn't even matter how much you steal anymore.
It's not how much you steal. It's what you steal.
And how you steal it.
At no point in the game will the mission be a failure because you didn't steal enough. If any loot must be lifted, then it is one item for story reasons and you will be led to it by my personal bane, the quest marker. Garrett's trinkets like the rope arrow were circumcised in their functionality as well. While in the original trilogy you could fire these arrows everywhere you liked and would produce a rope when shot into any wooden surface, even if it was stupid to do so, Thief 2014 told you where exactly you could use these arrows and forbade you from using them anywhere else. And this is just one of many gadgets that got the dummy treatment. Furthermore, if you want to play as a brutal murderer even on the highest difficulty, that is encouraged now. Assassinating the guards is now a sport because you get a bonus for this specific playstyle at the end of every mission. And to be fair, you also get a reward for staying undetected during the whole mission. But since killing is way easier than finding a way around the guards, well, guess what people did? There's no penalty anymore for getting into fights either. The clunky waltz you had to do while hoping for the best is now way more dynamic. Garrett can easily bob and weave while dishing out some damage himself via QuickTime inputs. And if you really want to be a brawler, then you can even buy some upgrades for your club and your bow to make assaults even easier. In this game, Garrett is not a thief, he's a competent fighter with athletic traits. I didn't even dig that deep, but it should be clear by now that stealth, stealing and exploration became optional in a game that was supposed to be all about stealth, stealing and exploration. In the earlier games, the theme of being a thief was played straight, with all the pros and cons that entails. But the remake blurs these lines of what that means by infusing the game with easier and more palatable action sequences. Oh yeah, and it also takes away the fun of figuring stuff out by simply telling you where to go. The only thing you have to do to win here is fulfill some mission objectives, which might be to steal one special item per mission and reach the end of the level, which you can do by killing everyone in sight. And yes, you can even do this on the hardest difficulty. This is the milk run I was talking about. You don't need to actively do something, you just need to follow. Now the question is, why is the game this way? Did the guys who made this never played one of the 3 titles that came before, or did they simply not care? And the truth is, it doesn't matter. The simplest and most logical explanation is yet again
Money!
The evidence is in the fact that Thief 2014 was intended to be released for everything. It was released for the PC, the previous Xbox, the future Xbox, the PlayStation 3 and the PlayStation 4. Somebody said everybody needs to play this game and we need to reach everybody. But just shipping a game to every console and hope for success is not enough. Big sweet money can only be raked in by catering to the widest audience possible, which also means you have to appeal to the lowest common denominator. And that means the admittedly complex mechanics of stealth and exploration the Thief trilogy is known for, well, they had to be watered down to something a lot of people can enjoy even if they never played a stealth game before. And believe me, I get it. Not everyone's got the patience to sit in the bushes for 5 minutes just to work up the courage to finally sneak around the first guard and then get busted by the next one right around the corner. And then the game even mocks you by telling you to try again, you dimwit. In the eyes of every casual gamer, this is just frustrating beyond belief. So the admittedly complex mechanics of stealth and exploration had to be watered down. It is also a given that stealth was and will always be a niche topic. If you want to reach more people with this, then it has to become more forgiving, more palatable, more secret agent-like. But by doing exactly that, by eroding the challenge and the core idea which made Thief what it is, you also take away the player agency. The immersiveness and the difficulty which was needed to make stealth meaningful is gone now. And for everyone who says, well, just turn up the difficulty, that doesn't work anymore. With the removal of these core mechanics, the difficulty you can choose at the beginning of the game doesn't mean anything anymore. And that's because the game is already made easy by default. And this trend towards easier gameplay is not unique to Thief. Look at any game or franchise that was made during the last years and you can see the effects. Prominent examples include the Elder Scrolls series, which simplified gameplay elements like the skill progression and the experimentation with alchemy and magic. It also simplified travel by introducing quest markers to everywhere, which put a hamper on the joy of exploring and finding things on your own. These differences can be witnessed when playing Morrowind and Skyrim side by side. Then we have the Diablo franchise, which demanded meticulous stat management and skill allocation in earlier titles. Skill points can only be earned by leveling up, and once you spent such a skill point, it was gone. You had to live with that decision or create another character. And sure, it sounds like a downside, but with a little know-how, you were able to create specialized characters that fit your playstyle and were extremely useful in multiplayer sessions. Diablo 3 streamlined that process. Here you're able to switch skill loadouts on the fly for optimized casual play. Every single character is now a generalist instead of a specialist by design. You can have all the skills all the time and never have to think about the skills you may have missed out on. And I would like to talk about Dragon Age Veilguard, but I didn't play it, so I'll not talk about it. But I can talk about Cyberpunk, which is the quintessential example of easy, casual, turning your brain off gameplay. See, I made an experiment. I played the game on the hardest difficulty, and because this is an RPG, I ignored the stat system. Reason being, if my decisions and my build really matter, then I should not be able to progress until I am forced to specialize in some way at some point in time. Make a choice, make a decision, live with it, come on, I expect this from an RPG. And this did not happen. Not even once. I deliberately made my V as weak, dumb, and antisocial as I could, and I left it this way. And I was still able to get through everything. Every mission, side mission, minigame, all of it. Sure, some fringe outcomes were not available to me, but still I cleared all missions. Despite the fact that I played as somebody who is in no way fit to be a smooth-talking, gunslinging mercenary. But that is precisely what the game shoehorned me into. It is still hilarious to me that I was able to win all the races using the slowest and cheapest car available, or that I was able to become the boxing champion with a strength of 3. And why is that? Because Cyberpunk got the same treatment as the Thief remake. In order for everybody to enjoy this game, we have to give the player all the choices with no consequences attached, which lowers the difficulty but also diminishes the meaningfulness of your choices. And that is the trade-off. You can't have one without the other. And yeah, I know what I sound like. I made it sound like accessibility is the enemy, which is of course not true. Accessibility can take many forms, and generally speaking, it is not a bad thing to implement. But it all comes down to how you use it. When done right, accessibility can open doors to countless players who would otherwise never experience the joy of gaming. Celeste, a universally loved indie darling, is a brutally challenging platformer, but it has an assist mode, which lets players adjust difficulty without undermining the sense of achievement the game is built on. If the game's too fast, slow it down. If there are not enough dashes to save yourself from a difficult platform, give yourself more. Or make yourself simply indestructible because it's up to you. Celeste is made to be a difficult experience, but it lets you decide if and in which way you want it to be easier. Which is, quite frankly, a genius way to create a game. Make the core idea challenging and give the player the option to make it more accessible. You can always take away some enemies, skip a difficult boss fight, or make permadeath simply disappear. That way you get the best of both worlds and everyone is able to enjoy the game on their terms. Now, do I say that Elden Ring needs an easy mode? No, absolutely not, but we'll get to that later. There are some other examples too that use accessibility to their benefit. Years after the game Soma came out, the devs patched in a safe mode, where monsters don't attack you anymore. Sure, it turns this horror gem where monsters chase and eat you into a walk in the park, but it also gives scared players a chance to partake in the story. Heat Signature is yet another challenging game because every run you do might end in a permadeath, which means you lose all your progress and have to start from scratch. Some players didn't like that feature and wanted it to be removed. And the creator's counter-argument was that if he did that, then Heat Signature would be a totally different game, and one that generates less interesting stories overall. So he didn't decide to remove permadeath, but he made it optional. By the way, this is exactly the approach Contra III and many other games from the 90s and 2000s had. Leave the core idea intact, but draw new players in by offering them an easier point of entry. But it seems like this business model is just not in practice anymore. Instead, we're going for the more lenient experience. And by every financial metric provided, this is exactly what the people want. Diablo 3, runaway success. Diablo 4 sales revenue already exceeded 1 billion, and we can't forget about Diablo Immortal, which is, oh Jesus, so goddamn boring and predatory. But despite valid criticism, it's also incredibly successful. Not to mention all the hype around Cyberpunk, which is also a massive commercial success. And if you want to stay in the stealth genre, then have a look at Dishonored, which is undeniably an enjoyable gaming experience. I do like Dishonored for what it is, but it is definitely not a difficult game, because just like in Thief, you can forego stealth altogether and just become murder incarnate. The only bad consequence is a different ending. If you want to make the game old school difficult, then you have to set some rules for yourself, which is a stark contrast to some of the earlier high difficulty Thief missions where just getting seen basically resulted in an automatic game over. So to answer the question if the big companies will ever stop making games like that, the answer is a resounding no. There is simply too much money in it. And if I were the boss of such a big company, I would do the same thing. I would be stupid not to. So the difficulty has to go. Whether it enhances the overall experience or at least prolongs the game time like the older Nintendo games, that's not the question. The question is, and always has been, how much money can we make with this product? Somebody tried to kill difficulty only for it to take the next evolutionary step. The trend towards accessibility caused a counterculture to erupt. While most games deliberately forego difficulty as much as they can, certain games rose to the challenge and rekindled the fire and passion for difficult games anew. Not just that, they embraced it, made difficulty their core identity. And we love them for it. No one can deny that 2011 was the year we all collectively perished on a bridge, fighting an uphill battle against a dragon we seemingly had no chance against, just to be reborn time and time again at a bonfire. And so we adapted. We picked our battles, we strategized, we ran through the gauntlet that was Sen's Fortress only to be eaten alive by a goddamn mimic. We found our own individual ways to grow, saw things that aroused us as much as they disgusted us, hopefully. We cultivated our dark souls and we were prepared to die 1,000, nay 1,000,000 times over until we were finally strong enough. And when we were, we came back and took what was now, after proving ourselves countless times, rightfully ours. Victory. Past and current games lean heavily on cinematic experiences, simplified mechanics and forgiving gameplay to appeal to a broader audience. And Dark Souls shattered this trend by offering an unapologetically punishing experience. And it did way more than just use the Nintendo hard formula to do it. It also used environmental storytelling and interconnected world design. Its success was staggering. It created a brand new genre, the Souls-like, which influenced game design to this very day. But that's not the end of the story. At some point in time, indie developers even came up with this insane idea of creating a game that is specifically designed to make you throw a chair because it's so goddamn difficult. These are the so-called rage games, and even I stay away from those. Ask Markiplier what he thinks of those games. As an internet star, he has to play them, and I don't envy him in the slightest. I still have my hands full with Ikaruga. I got this game for 10 years and I haven't beaten it once. This rebirth not only shaped an era but also cemented the importance of difficulty as an integral part of game design. And have you noticed it yet? Whenever a truly challenging game comes along, it has way better chances of being discovered because it just sticks out like a lighthouse in that vast ocean of accessibility. Take Cuphead for example. It's a critically acclaimed title that sold millions of copies, all because it took inspiration from the old 80s and 90s games. Super Meat Boy is yet another example in the same vein, just the genre is different, that's all. And who can forget Rain World, which is worshipped by its audience but at the same time panned by critics for being such an unforgiving experience. And that's despite the game already featuring an easy mode called Monk. But as I am writing this video for what feels like ages, one thing became clear to me. Most of these games are not for the masses. And they will never be for the masses. Even though Elden Ring was a breakout success, it didn't outperform a game like Hogwarts Legacy. So, as it turns out, the hardcore audience were the niche audience all along. And it will always be a niche audience. And guess what? That's okay. Sure, the hardcore people got the ball rolling with the arcades, but back then it was just them. Well, us, really. But then a miracle happened. More and more people discovered what we already knew, that playing video games is fun, that this is a medium like no other, able to test our limits and to tell interactive stories that touches hearts. It may not look like it, but all of these people are an enrichment to something we already loved. Without the other side of the coin that focuses on accessibility, story or atmosphere, we would never have gotten games like Final Fantasy, Metal Gear Solid, Animal Crossing. Without these people, Spiritfarer wouldn't be possible, and my favorite game of all time, Terranigma, wouldn't exist. Sure, it sucks that this medium is treated as a cash grab money cow, but even that doesn't matter. Because gaming is now such a cultural juggernaut that there will eventually be a right game for the right audience. There will always be a bunch of people who want to create an experience tailor-made to your wishes. So yeah, I love my cozy games too, and if you ever touch my Harvest Moon save file, I will commit murder. And no, I am not worried that games will ever get too easy. Even if this is the state of the industry right now, all I need to do for the next challenge to arrive at my door is wait. I know it will come. I am built this way, I live for it. And I can't wait for the next one that storms into my life, kicks down the door and screams into my face, "You will never survive this." Because guess what? I'll be here, waiting, and with a joyful and defiant grin on my face, I am going to say, "Bring it, bitch."